What would the earth look like after Noah's flood? What features would we expect to see that would confirm such an event? There would be great tectonic upheavals throughout the globe and catastrophic events on the land from such a torrential flood. And where would all the water go? Many geologic clues exist on the planet today. Coming up next, Shaping Earth's Surface Part 2 with Michael Oard. Hello, my friends, and welcome to Origins. My name's Donn Chapman. It's my privilege to be your host. As you may know, Origins is a forum where we take the evidence of science and we use it to validate the truth of creation. We do that by finding guests who are great creation scientists, and today is no exception. Michael Oard is with me. He received his education at the University of Washington, where he studied atmospheric science. He then was a research meteorologist for 6 years at the university before working for 30 years for the National Weather Service. He now is a full-time researcher for creation science, and his friends tell me he is one of the most tenacious researchers they know. We are very blessed to have you with us today, my friend. God bless you.
Thank you.
Today we're going to talk about shaping the surface of the earth, which really has to do with Noah's flood, doesn't it?
Yes, the draining of the flood waters off the land. See, if the world's globally flooded, you have to get the waters off for the present topography.
And I was just telling you, off the air, as a layman in this area, I always think about the waters coming down, but really a lot of what happened was a result of how the water ran away more than the water coming down.
Well, yeah, when you see the topography of the earth, that is almost totally a result of the waters running off.
And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, not everybody believes in a universal flood, do they?
Oh, no.
Most scientists don't, or most scientists do, or divided?
Most scientists don't. They think it's one of the most outrageous phenomenon that possible from the Bible.
A fairy tale.
Yeah, fairy tale.
But you see great evidence for it.
Oh, yeah, right on the surface of the earth, right before our eyes, and easily seen, not esoteric.
And so Jesus said, if you have eyes, you'll see. And you think it's because people aren't looking at what's all really obvious.
Yes, they don't have those flood glasses on, or biblical glasses. They're looking at it from the way the world wants them to look at it, from uniformitarian glasses, slow processes over millions of years. And as a result of that, they can't see the evidence for the flood. And we can kind of summarize it by this diagram right here. This is sort of like a flash flood, where we have two stages of the flood. A flooding stage where we have a mechanism that causes the whole earth to flood, and it peaks, and then it runs off, the retreating stage. So there's two stages. But this could be divided up into 5 phases. The first phase is that 40 days and 40 nights of rain right in here. So during that time was probably the worst part of the flood. The mechanism was unleashed, and most catastrophic. The rain fell, and the fountains of the great deep were open. Then from day 41 to the peak of the flood, it probably was a slow rise. This is similar to a flash flood. A flash flood, you have a quick rise and then a slow rise before peak. And so that's a prevailing. And during that time, you probably had a lot of less tectonic, but you had a lot of movements of the water back and forth. And that's probably what caused a lot of these cyclical sediments in this period there. Then the flood peaked, and then it started to run off.
That's day about 150.
About day 150,
okay,
yes.
That's when the water's the highest over the earth.
Yes, about day 150.
Okay.
And then the waters have to run off the present continents. Well, how does that happen? Well, Psalm 104, verse 8 says, the mountains rose, the valleys sank down. So as that happens, and the continents rise and the ocean basins sink, the water's running off, sometimes at high speeds, and as it's doing that, it's eroding. And so the currents are wide at the start. In phase 4 there, right in there, they're very wide, and so they'll be eroding in wide sheets, causing large planation surfaces. They're taking resistant rocks and moving them long distances. Then we transform into phase 5 there, and that's when more mountains and plateaus are up above the water, so the water's forced to go around these, more channelized. And so you form different features of the surface of the earth called landforms, superimposed on those formed in the earlier wide current flow. And that's what I want to talk about right now is the landforms formed during that 5th phase.
Well, Michael, as we talk about the formation of the caverns and so forth in phase 5, sounds exciting. Would you go to the board and share with us what you have for us today?
Okay.
Thank you.
The first one is water and wind gaps, which I'll define. They form rapidly, carved by flow perpendicular to mountains, ridges, and plateaus. Well, let's take a look at a water gap. Here's a water gap right here. It's called the Shoshone water gap. Right in there. And these are the Rattlesnake Mountains right here. And east of I'm looking west, and further west is Yellowstone Park. The Shoshone River comes out of Yellowstone Park and cuts through this gap in the Rattlesnake Mountains, and it's 2,500 feet deep. And this river, when it came out, when the sediments were just a little bit higher back there, it could have gone around this mountain like this and out like this. It's much more easy, but for some reason it goes right through the mountain. That's a water gap. Why did it do that? Well, they don't really know. Here's a closer look at it. Now, these are hard rocks. They're sedimentary rocks with a granite core in the middle of the Rattlesnake Mountains. And when you go to the other side, this is looking, this right here is part of the Rattlesnake Mountains, the southern end of it. Here's the area it could have gone through right here. Buffalo Bill Reservoir raised the level of the Shoshone River, and they had to put another dam out in here to keep the water from flowing out in the Bighorn Basin. So that's where the river should have flowed, you know, if this was hundreds of thousands of years of a slow process or millions of years. But instead, it cuts through the water gap or makes a gap in the mountains. Now, they don't know how rivers do this. They don't run uphill and then down. And so they're pretty perplexed on all that happens. So let's take a look at some water gaps. Here's a famous one in the Appalachian Mountains near Harrisburg. There's a series of them in the Appalachians right north of Harrisburg, but here's the one in the front where it cuts through this ridge here when it could have easily gone around. Now, the Appalachian Mountains have 1,700 water gaps. Mm-hmm. Like this, 1,700. There's thousands of them across the earth. And a water gap, like I said, is a cut through a mountain ridge where the water is flowing through it. Now, there's wind gaps where they're not cut deep enough in the ridge and only air goes through, so it's called a wind gap. And they're like passes. Like here's a famous one, the Cumberland Wind Gap, where the pioneers went from Virginia to Kentucky. This is on the border of Virginia and Kentucky. The sedimentary rocks used to be like this, and then water cut it down to a notch like this, but didn't cut it down deep enough for water to go through, so air only goes through. So that's a wind gap. There are hundreds of wind gaps in the Appalachians. In fact, there's thousands of wind gaps, just like water gaps, across the whole earth. Now, the Zagros Mountains are really interesting. They're very young mountains. They're called late Pliocene within the jargon of the...
Where are those mountains?
They're in Iran.
Okay.
They're in western Iran. And there are 300 water gaps. And they do all kinds of crazy, strange things. They're up to 8,000 feet deep. Cutting gorges, 8,000 feet deep, deeper than Grand Canyon. And sometimes they'll flow into a mountain range and then come back out, do all kinds of squirrely things that they can't explain. But a man did a PhD thesis on it, Thomas Oberlander, and wrote this book, The Zagros Streams. And some of the things he says in here makes it sound like these rivers have volition, that they actually purposely want to go through mountains instead of down valleys like they're supposed to. So this is just a quick quote. He says, "The Zagros drainage pattern is distinctive by virtue of its disregard of major geological obstructions, both on a general scale and in detail." In other words, it totally disregards these mountains and ridges. Certain streams ignore structure completely. Now notice this one. Some appear to seek obstacles to transect, as if it had a mind of its own. Why does it do that? Well, nature doesn't produce things like that, and they have difficult time explaining water and wind gaps.
Yeah. Water is always going to have the same characteristic. It's always going to seek its own level. So that's not a very good explanation, that it has a mind of its own.
Yeah, right. It's going to go down valleys where it's supposed
That's right.
to. It's going to go around barriers.
Certainly.
But when they go through them, now that is a big problem.
Yes.
The significance of this, they're not forming today except on a very small scale. There's little or no evidence for their uniformitarian hypotheses, which I've gone into.
Right.
And we have an analog for them. When the giant Lake Missoula flood in the northwest U.S., a 2,000-foot deep lake trapped by a finger of the ice sheet, collapsed, it lifted the ice, and it went through eastern Washington, 600 feet deep over Spokane, Washington, and carved up eastern Washington, and it went over a ridge, and it cut a water gap and a wind gap. Where the Palouse River used to flow into the Columbia River going west, then it goes south through that gap where it was formed. This is the peak of the Ice Age. So we actually have an analog from the Lake Missoula flood. So this is kind of a summary block diagram of how the flood model forms water and wind gaps. You have the water's draining. Remember, where the water is draining, you're transforming from wide currents to narrow currents. And it's perpendicular to a ridge, which is either coming up or the water's going down or both. And then with time, the tops show up and it forces the water to channelize. And it's channelizing, it's got to accelerate. Why? Because you're forming the same amount of water is now being forced through more narrow areas, like water in a wide pipe going through a narrow part of the pipe. It has to speed up. And right. When it speeds up, it erodes tremendously. And it digs those gorges rapidly, right here and right there. And then when it's all over with, the rivers naturally take advantage of the low spot, and they become water gaps. And the other areas where it gave up for some reason and all went around through here is now the wind gap. So we can easily explain water and wind gaps during the flood by water flowing perpendicular to barriers. Now I'm going to transition to the second channelized landform, and that is a pediment. A pediment is a planation surface, a flat surface formed by water at the foot of a mountain or a ridge, carved by water. That's what a pediment is. Here's a picture. This is in the Ruby Valley, southwest of where I live in Montana. The mountains are over to the right. The sedimentary rocks dip like this, but the planation surface, called a pediment, which is at the foot of the mountain over here, slopes like that, a narrow angle. Now, nature by itself today does not do things like this. It cuts things up, forms canyons and valleys. It doesn't form a flat surface, especially on tilted rocks, cutting them all evenly the same, hard or soft rocks the same. That's a pediment. And when you look at the material on top of this pediment, you look, it's rounded rocks, the rock hammer for scale, that covered, this is by water, has carved this pediment. And some of these rocks on this pediment are not from the local area. Some of these are those quartzites that are from central Idaho, transported to long distances. So it's water that has created this flat surface pediment. There are thousands of pediments all over the earth. They're not forming today. They are being destroyed. Therefore, there's powerful evidence of the flood runoff. And some evidence that they can't explain them is this quote from Donn, Geomorphology of Desert Environments. You see them a lot in desert environments because they have not eroded away yet. but you do see them in a lot of areas with a lot of precipitation, like up in the Yukon. He says pediments have long been the subject of geomorphological scrutiny. Unfortunately, the net results of this long history of study is not altogether clear or cogent and has not produced a clear understanding of the processes responsible for pediment development. You know, translating this a little better, I was a weather forecaster for 30 years, and I became a master of weasel words. It may rain today or it may not. So I could tell other people using weasel words. These are weasel words for we really haven't got a clue how a pediment forms.
He really is saying that we don't have any answer at all, do we?
Right. And here's kind of how I believe they formed during the flood in the block diagram. Instead of water going perpendicular to a ridge forming water and wind gaps, the water was going parallel. And the strata was uplifting and it was bending in this region right here. And as it does that, it expands and cracks, and it's very vulnerable to erosion like that. So that's where you're going to erode it the faster. So the ridge is going to become a valley. This is, you see this as the results of this in mountains. And the water is becoming channelized down the valley more and more, moving at high speeds, probably 100 miles an hour. And it forms these, erodes the edges of the in here, forming a flat surface called a pediment. And after the water drains, that's what it looks like. And there's your flat surface, left, right, at the foot of the mountains. That's how I believe pediments formed during channelized flood runoff. Yet they can't explain it, but we can explain it easily.
But without the flood, there's no real explanation, is there?
Right, there isn't.
Michael, we have to take a break. We're going to come back and expand on this and present the rest of your evidence. But don't you go away. We'll be right back.
Today's guest on Origins, Michael Oard, earned his Master of Science degree in Atmospheric Science and has retired from the National Weather Service after 30 years of service. He is currently a researcher and speaker for Creation Ministries International, where he has authored many creation articles and books, including Evidence for Creation in the Biblical Flood and Frozen in Time. Book orders are being taken at 800-616-1264. Mike can be reached at Creation Ministries International, P.O. Box 350, Powder Springs, Georgia 30127, or visit the website at creation.com.
We are back with Michael Oard, and we're talking about shaping the Earth's surface, and more specifically on this show, we are talking about channelized flow landform. And we've talked about two of those, and there's a third one. Would you remind us of the first two and then tell us about the third one?
Well, the first two are water and wind gaps. These are gorges cut perpendicular to mountains where water runs through one and wind through the other. These can easily form as the floodwaters are draining or the mountains coming up, and it becomes channelized, and then it carves it rapidly by high-speed flows. So that's one. And the second one is a pediment. It's a flat surface or a planation surface at the foot of mountains. And these are formed by water flowing at high speeds down the valley, eroding the valley. See, all this is during erosion, eroding the valley and then leaving the flat surface at the edges of the mountain. Sometimes they're on both sides, sometimes they're only on one side of a mountain valley. So those are pediments. They have extreme difficulty explaining them, but we can explain them easily.
Without a flood, there isn't a good explanation.
No.
Yeah, there is. And there's a third one. Will you tell us about that?
Yes, these are submarine canyons.
Submarine canyons.
These are submarine canyons carved perpendicular to the shoreline on the continental shelf and slope. These are not trenches, which are generally parallel to the shore. These are perpendicular cuts. And they form after practically all the continental shelf sediments are laid down and deposited during wide flows of currents. But when they channelize and focused by canyons on land, then they channelize and they cut. They actually erode instead of deposit, forming what are now submarine canyons. Let's take a look at one right here.
Okay.
This is Monterey Canyon. It starts right near the beach at Moss Landing, right in there. And it comes out here, forms a meander, and then there's another canyon, Carmel Canyon, right in here that meets it. That's a fault canyon, but this goes out like that and then way out into the deep sea. This is about a mile deep right here. So in Monterey Bay, you have a deep canyon that right near the shore. So that's typical of a submarine canyon. There are hundreds of these submarine canyons along the continental shelf and slope. Now, the average length of a submarine canyon is 50 miles. The average depth is 3,000 feet, almost as deep as Grand Canyon. So
wow.
these are major features. It's like having 300 Grand Canyons all around that you can't see. So these are major features. Some of them are actually deeper than Grand Canyon. And one is actually longer than Grand Canyon, the Bering Canyon up in the Bering Sea shelf. And sometimes they're cut in granite, just not the sedimentary rocks deposited early during the retreating stage of the flood, but sometimes they cut through the granite of the continental crust. So this series of block diagrams sums it up. You have what I call sheet flow, which is wide currents, the consistency of a sheet, long and thin, and they're eroding the continents, and they're depositing along the edge of the continents, right in here, forming the continental shelf and slope. So you're depositing there. But then with time, the currents channelize more, and as they channelize, they start eroding instead of depositing. And remember, the water is going down, and this current is being channelized on land there, the valley on land. It's been focusing, and it's putting all kinds of debris right in this area, right in here, and it's the debris mostly that goes down the continental slope, cutting the canyon. And as this continues, more and more, the water drains, and finally, at the very end, that's what you have. The canyon is generally a mirror image, right in here, of what you have of the canyon on land. Oh. And that's why they say rivers were responsible for this, because a lot of times you have rivers coming out, but a lot of times you don't. You don't have rivers, so, and they're perplexed. It's the valley that counts. So that's how I believe submarine canyons form easily in the flood. While they can't explain it, we have a mechanism by the channelized flow phase of the flood.
I'm fascinated that you're saying that, obviously what we assume when we begin to look at something very often determines the outcome that we reach. If we start out by saying there wasn't a flood, we won't see the evidence of the flood. If we say, well, the Bible says there's a flood, is there evidence out there to verify that? You see things that other scientists wouldn't see, don't you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I see evidence all over the place. What we're talking about, features on the surface of the earth, is a whole genre of evidence. There's even more than what I've told you.
Sure.
And they all point to the runoff of the floodwaters that is expected from the flood, but they can't explain it, or they try. They have lots of hypotheses, and I've gone into these and analyzed them, but they hardly ever make any sense.
Well, by their own words, they tell us that really it's a mystery, or we don't understand.
When they're honest about
yes,
it.
Yeah, that's right. So it keeps filtering through. Well, you've done a great service to the church and to those of us who believe God's Word. Just in just a few seconds, tell me, how important is it for Christians to be able to point to a worldwide flood if we're going to believe the Bible?
Well, the global flood is powerfully stated as such in the Bible. Jesus believed in a global flood, and yet it's one of the most criticized doctrines in the Bible, saying, oh, it's a fairy tale. You can't have a global flood. That's too much of a catastrophe. And so the culture closes their minds to it and says it's all due to slow processes over millions of years. But when you put on your flood glasses, I see it all over the place. There is lots of evidence all over. And what this does is it supports what we read about in the Bible. The Bible's verified, and we can trust not only the history of the Bible, we can trust the spiritual things taught in the Bible also.
And that's the key.
That's the key.
If we start off believing that this is a fairy tale, when we get to the resurrection, we're not going to believe that either, are we?
That'd be pretty tough.
Yeah. So your work is very important to not only creation science, but to our faith. Thank you for the good work you're doing.
You're welcome.
My friends, I hope you've heard what Michael said, that his faith in a resurrected Christ really sets on the foundation of being able to verify the things in history that the Bible states, like the worldwide flood. He's done us a great service showing us evidence that can only lead us to believe that the flood was both real and that it was universal. My friend, I hope that you've heard this information, that you're chewing on it today, and I hope it will bring you to the conclusion I've reached, that it's God's view that He created you. And that should be your worldview too. I hope you'll join us again soon here on Origins. And until then, God bless you, my friend. Good to have you.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint information presented today, you can download a PDF file from our website at www.originstv.org. Or for DVD of this series, send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins Program, number 1305, Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and the financial support of you, our Cornerstone Television family.